So I think since we are sharing the screen, I don't think you will be able to do that right now. Can we go over the guidelines once and?
Of course, go for it. Yeah. I'm listening.
Yes. Harshil, you can start.
A very good evening to everyone. So today we'll be having a lecture, and you guys need to just follow the following guidelines. All of you are requested to turn off your microphones throughout the session, and please make sure to use the chat box in case you have any questions for the speaker, and kindly send your questions to the questions moderator. And all of you are encouraged to turn on their videos if it's possible, and everyone is expected to maintain decorum during the lecture, and only questions pertaining to the lecture or the topic they will be taken up. Thank you.
Dia, you can stop sharing the screen. So were you able to log in from the other device?
Yeah, I'm okay. You can take your time. We're not starting for a couple of minutes, right?
So we can start at 7 if it's fine, like 3 minutes more.
7. Okay, let me subtract. I have to learn to subtract 10 and a half from 7. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, no problem.
Yes.
How did the whole festival go? Did it go well?
Yes, sir, it did.
Good to hear.
Now I'll hand it over to Satvik for introduction.
Greetings to one and all who have taken time to join us today for this closing lecture session of our National Economics Festival 2022. To conclude this exhilarating 2-day journey, packed with the thrills of competitiveness and discourse, we at the Economic Society of St. Stephen's College take one last step in making this weekend special for you. To elucidate on topics like sovereign wealth funds, UBI, and redistribution along with their implications, I'm extremely pleased to welcome our guest for this evening, Dr. Debraj Ray, the Julius Silver Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Arts and Science in the New York University. Sir is an alumnus of the Calcutta and Cornell universities and has also held several prestigious academic positions prior to joining the NYU. Serving as the co-editor of the American Economic Review, Sir specializes in the research of game theory and development economics. He has been conferred with awards in teaching and research besides his engagements with prominent journals and organizations like the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Hope this gathering finds you in the best of spirits, sir. With a hearty good morning, I would now pass on the mic to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me? Just nod your heads vociferously. That's okay. Good. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good evening, whatever. It's a horrible snowy day here today. I don't know how it is in Delhi, but probably a sunny, polluted day, or hopefully an unpolluted day. Welcome to this closing lecture. It's just going to be something fairly informal. I'll use some slides, but feel free to chat with me. You know, I can see the chat screen. Hopefully, I'll be able to sort of follow up on that. And also, you know, you can raise your hand and ask questions, or don't raise your hand and ask questions. It's okay. I mean, I'm used to it. And so let me share the screen. Do I have the right to share? Yes, I do. Preview. I hope I'm sharing the right screen. Yeah. Can you all? Okay, just let me know if you can't see the screen, but it should be okay. Okay, so my talk has this sort of cryptic title, The Future of Development. It's not as sexy as it sounds, but anyway, I'll tell you about what I'm doing here. So the references are based on some work I've done with Dilip Mukherjee, who's a professor at Boston University. The references there, I can send you guys the slides also if you want at any time. And it's also based with, sorry, I'm trying to do something else when I'm talking to you. It's also based on work with Parikshit Ghosh, who is a professor at the Delhi School of Economics, and hopefully some of you have or will encounter him someday. He's quite a character, and maybe he's even listening, who knows. So let me get to the topic right away. So I start with what I call the fourth fundamental law of capitalism. Okay, and the fourth fundamental law is, with economic growth, capital must displace labor, and the labor share in national income must progressively vanish. Now, when I write that, of course, there's all sorts of question marks in your head. What does he mean by the fourth fundamental law, right? Where are the other three, right? And also, what's all this about the labor share in national income progressively vanishing? Well, one at a time. The fourth fundamental law comes from a little homage to Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. As you guys all know, this is a big book. It's typically the book we use to prevent the door from, shutting. But some of us have also read the book. It has lots of very interesting data and facts in it. And it also has what he calls three fundamental laws, which I'm not going to talk about. I've criticized these so-called laws in other talks, but still, nevertheless, it's a fantastic book. Here's an example of how these things can attain memehood, right? And here's Steve Colbert holding up a T-shirt saying R greater than G. That's his third fundamental law, right? So in general, Piketty's three fundamental laws are: first, an accounting identity about capital income; second, the very famous Harrod-Domar equation that you guys all know about; and finally, there's this famous R greater than G. But none of it is stuff that I'm going to talk about today. And frankly, nothing is a law, right? So my fourth law, which is capital tends to displace labor, is far from being obviously true. But that's like the crystal ball gazing that I want to do today. Okay, for you guys. So there are two parts to my talk. If I have time, I know I don't have much more than 50 minutes or maybe at most an hour. So I'm going to try and go a little quickly. The first part is going to be developing an argument for this so-called fourth fundamental law and having fun doing it, hopefully, which will need a little bit, but only a little bit of economic theory just for the fun of it, just to see how you guys react to it. And the second is I'm going to talk about some sort of a policy, a set of policies to address the implications of this law. And specifically, as Satvik said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a sovereign fund based on incorporated economic wealth. Okay, so the fourth fundamental law, the labor share national income must progressively vanish. Yeah, well, you know, I don't know whether you guys do this at St. Stephen's or in undergraduate courses in economics anymore, but when we were undergraduates, when I was an undergraduate in Calcutta, we used to be taught these things called the Kaldor Facts, right? So Kaldor was an economist, an English economist who had these sort of salient facts about economic growth. And one of the facts was that the labor share of income, of national income, is typically constant. Yeah, and so that's why I've called this slide the death of a Kaldor fact, because we are starting to see, and we have been seeing, in fact, for some decades, a steady decline in the share of labor, the functional share of labor. This is not the share of workers as such, because workers might be holding stocks or whatever, but the functional share of labor in national income. So this slide I've taken from the paper of Marta Guerriero. And what she does is, why are there so many lines there, firstly? And the answer is that there's so many lines there because it's very hard to measure exactly what the labor share of national income is. You know, if you're self-employed and you earn some income, is that a return to capital? Is that a return to labor? So as you might imagine, there are ambiguities, right? Part of what you earn is a return to capital. Part of what you earn is a return to labor. And then depending on how you allocate the share of self-employment income to capital or labor, you get a whole bunch of different measures. But fortunately, or unfortunately, as the case may be, right? So these are 6 such measures, and they're all going down. Okay, so it's not a question about quibbling about the definitions and so forth. They're all in a bit of trouble in that sense. Hang on. Yeah, I was just trying to arrange the video panel here. So hold on. Yeah, so you see this, by the way, for individual countries very clearly, and not just developed countries. You see this for developing countries. And as soon as I say this, I'm sure you guys all remember this phrase that we all see in India all the time, jobless growth, right? Well, jobless growth is not a phenomenon which is specific or special to India, though India, as you'll see in a second, may have been exhibiting this in rather strong form. You see a fall in the share of labor, though this is not exactly a rise in employment and so forth, but a fall in the income share of labor in different countries over here. And this is another interesting diagram, which I've taken from the work of Karabarbonis and Neyman, where you look at labor share trends. So on the x-axis, those squiggly little letters are different country codes, okay? And on the y-axis, those are labor share trends in percentage points per 10 years. So that means there's the zero line over here, right? As you might imagine, this is the zero line. And so if you're below the zero line, it means that you're losing that many percentage points in labor share every 10 years. And you can see this arrayed by different countries. I forget how many countries there are in the sample, maybe I think 60 countries or so. And for example, if you want to look at some of the world's biggest economies, then you can see, for example, the UK goes the other way. It actually has a slight gain in labor share, but by and large, the other major economies have had a decline in labor share. Now you might think, okay, you know, this is perhaps because the kind of stuff that we are producing, the composition of production has changed. We moved from producing, let's say, bananas to producing iPods, and that, you know, that maybe has a naturally lower labor share, right? But you see, at least if you look at broad industrial groupings, so in this particular diagram, I put, you know, mining, transport, manufacturing, utilities, wholesale, retail, and so forth, you see that the tendency for a labor share decline is not entirely a compositional tendency. There's a tendency for this to happen industry grouping by industry grouping. So that's the point of this diagram. So now, this is not rocket science. We can just sort of sit around and think, why is this labor share falling? What is happening? Let's forget about our, solo growth model and this model and that model and just try to think from the basics, right? Well, one thing, for example, that in developed countries, people have talked about a lot is the famous China shock, right? So the China shock is like cheap goods flowing in, produced, very productively and sometimes very labor intensively. And as a result of that, in developed countries, people can't react to that. The wages go down, and so you get a declining share of labor. But of course, as we know, as I've said just a little while ago, this is happening everywhere. For example, if you look at jobless growth in India. So this is maybe part of an explanation for some developed countries, but can't be all of it. Then, of course, there is this whole other thing, which is very interesting. And I hope that some of you guys will work on this, right? So this idea of the rising gig economy, right? Where there's no such thing as a permanent job in the gig economy. Of course, it's sort of figurehead symbol being something like Uber, right? Where it's very hard for unions to make an inroad and so forth. And this will also naturally tend to decline wages and lead to a decline in the share of labor. But of course, one could disagree on whether the rise of the gig economy is a cause or an outcome, right, of the weakening of labor. So it may be something that's happening on the back of weakening labor. It could be, at best it's a correlate, but we can't say it's a cause. But I put it up there as an explanation. Then, for example, you might think about technical progress, right? Robotics. I don't know if all of you have been to the Boston Dynamics homepage. It's a scary sight, right? Like these robots dancing around and doing all sorts of nimble activities. Certainly old people like me feel that we have already been displaced, but in any case, it's pretty good. So, but I don't just mean robots. I also mean machine learning, software. So by robotics, technical progress, or robots, I generally mean this mix of hardware and software. But of course, again, if you're using common sense and if you're just starting this from scratch, you could still have the right to ask, why is technical progress necessarily slanted to the displacement of labor? It could be that technical progress gives us new products or new methods of doing things which are pro-labor, right, rather than anti-labor. So there's no particular a priori reason why technical progress should be doing this. But of course, it's an important component. Now, what I want you to do, though, is think about a little bit, go back even one more step and think of something even more basic. And that's the idea of capital-labor substitution. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about that before we talk about some of these other explanations, right? So now we are coming closer to what I was talking about in terms of jobless growth for India, right? So if you look at employment elasticities by sector. Now, so what's an employment elasticity? An employment elasticity is when you increase output by 1%. What is the amount of employment increase that happens in different sectors, okay? So I have up there 3 broad sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. And as you see over here, right, that this is a pretty low employment elasticity. It's saying that as output goes up by 1 percentage point, agriculture grows by 0.25%. Industry is also very low. Services, mercifully, is still high, right? Services are still relatively labor intensive. And you see in different regions of the world how low the employment elasticities of output are. Yeah? So there's something there where we seem to be moving away from labor. I think this is a very important fact. If you think of your famous isoquant, right? We are somehow all gliding up the isoquant. That's the kind of feeling one gets when looking at these numbers. So here, for example, is a slightly different figure. What it does is it has 2 sets of columns. Look, 1991 to 2000 and 2001 to 2015. And this is GDP growth, okay, in a country. And this is employment growth in the country. And this is aggregate GDP, this is not per capita GDP. Okay, and so this idea that in Egypt, for example, GDP growth yearly has been over 4%. Employment growth has been under 1.5%. The next line I even shudder to read, but you guys read it for yourself, right? The Indian numbers, it is dramatic. Yeah, and India has been growing very fast, as you all know, but with very slow employment growth attached to it. So there's your phenomenon of jobless growth right there in one line. But as you see, it's not necessarily restricted to, of course, some countries have done better than others, but you see that there is, again, evidence of capital labor substitution. So now, why is capital labor substitution happening? And that's kind of intuitively compelling at one level. Let's think about how, right? To think about it, go back to Ricardo, David Ricardo, many centuries ago. What did he say? He said, well, you know, think of land. The land is the ultimate scarce factor. Land is just sitting there. Man, as you guys are growing, you can grow. You have my permission to grow, but you'll have to substitute away from land. There's no getting away from substituting away from land because it's a fixed input. And of course, without a doubt, we've seen the move into the virtual space. We've seen skyscrapers. We've seen all sorts of ways in which industries have substituted away from land. Now take that idea of Ricardo and apply it to human beings. Think of a world in which human beings are like land. Of course, human beings grow, right? Population grows and shrinks. But just for a minute, look at everything in terms of per capita. So there's human beings and there's growth. So capital is getting accumulated. And there's just more and more capital relative to labor at every step, right? And when there's more and more capital relative to labor at every step, it makes sense that the relative price of capital is going to fall. So it makes sense that with economic growth per capita, there's going to be a natural move along the isoquant, right? Going from labor to capital. Now, of course, if you guys go another step, you'll remember that just moving along this isoquant doesn't tell you anything. Why doesn't it tell you anything? Because as you move, it's true that you're hiring more capital, but capital is getting cheaper. You're hiring less labor, but labor is getting more expensive. The share of labor has to do with the product of these two numbers, right? The wage rate to labor times the quantity of labor. And that is ambiguous as you're moving along the isoquant because it'll depend on that horrible thing that you must have learned in your first year that you have to remember for your exam, the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, right? So for instance, the Cobb-Douglas production function gives you the famous dividing line where the labor share in national income is independent, right? So the fact that we are moving here and there on the isoquant doesn't necessarily tell you that the share of capital or the share of labor is changing in any particular way. But it gives us a clue as to what is happening, right? And so this is what I want to try and explore a little bit further. So, and what I'm going to now talk about, so I'm still talking about this fourth fundamental law. I'm going to divide the rest of my talk, which is now a little bit newer and a little bit different from standard stuff, into two parts. The first, I'm going to call the human physical asymmetry. And the second is I'm going to directly try and build a model, not with equations, okay, but in words, a model which has both machine capital and robot capital. Okay, I want to talk about this in more detail. So let me go to what I call the human physical asymmetry. And this is one of the core parts of my talk. So I know it's evening for you and you want this conference maybe to end, but attend to this. This is important, okay? I want to tell you something very interesting and different about physical capital and human capital. Physical capital is infinitely scalable in any sector. It does not mean you want to scale it, but potentially it's scalable. If you have a conveyor belt, you can buy another conveyor belt. If you have a blast furnace, you can buy another blast furnace, right? And so are individual claims. When you're holding 2 shares of Apple, 3 shares of Apple, 4 shares of Apple, you know, depending on the amount of money you have, you can buy any number of shares of Apple, right? Or Dr. Reddy or Reliance or whatever it is, right? So your claims on these stocks are scalable. But your claims on human capital are not scalable. Firstly, because we all live in one physical body, right? We can push it by acquiring education and so forth. And secondly, because thank God we don't live in a slave economy, we cannot own the capital of others. I can't suddenly say now I own one share in Satvik's future income, right? Or Rhea's future income. I can't do it because I cannot own them. I don't have rights over their ownership. So as a result, all claims to capital have to be embodied in yourself, which means to some extent, of course, this is scalable. I can become an assistant professor and then an associate professor, the full professor. I can become better at my work. We can all do better inside the sector. But by and large, the fundamental nature of human capital accumulation is as we move across sectors, seeking out new occupations. Okay, so in some sense, I want you to think of physical capital scalability as going vertically up. And I want you to think of human capital scalability as going up, but also kind of like a rocket taking off, right? Like teetering off a little bit to the side as you move across different sectors. Now you say, why is that important? Well, it's important because it means that in any one particular sector, if there is ongoing growth, physical capital will tend to become cheap relative to human capital because there's bounds on how much human capital can expand in one particular sector. Now you can counteract that by bringing in new sectors into the picture, but that's another story that I'll tell you about in a second. So that the bottom line of this slide is just to remind you that this fundamental difference comes from the fact that physical capital is alienable, right? I can own a machine. A machine doesn't have a soul. I can own it. Whereas human beings, I cannot own. Okay, so a machine is alienable and a human being is inalienable, right? Okay, so as I said, the central implication of that statement is that per capita growth, if that happens, must involve the growing sectoral scarcity of human input. And of course, if you look at the data, this is, as I said, this is not rocket science. This is pretty obvious. If you look at the data, you'll see that over time, the relative price of investment goods has definitely fallen. Okay, so but I'm talking theory at the moment, but you can definitely see in the data. Okay, here are the few very brief equations I'm going to write down. So bear with me, they're not difficult. This is the way I want you to think about it. So this takes me to the second part of my theory, which has to do with machines and robots. Okay, so you keep the human and physical capital thing to one side. Now let's think about machines and robots. And the way I want you to think about it is that this is just like your growth model on steroids, right? So what's your growth model on steroids? Which is that there are many sectors in the economy and all of them have a production function. What is the production function produced with? Oh, we all know the answer, capital and labor. And the answer is here slightly different. I want to change that to having capital and something which I've denoted with tau, which I'll call tasks. So let's produce output with capital and tasks. So this capital, think of it as machines, things that human beings can work with. Okay? But I want you to think of tasks as being producible by humans or robots. Okay. And so I want you to think of there being a little auxiliary production function, a chota mota production function sitting next to this sectoral production function. And what is the chota mota doing? The chota mota production function is telling you how you might be able to combine humans and robots, perhaps, one substituting out for the other to create these tasks. Now, I don't necessarily want you to think of these robots as huge lumbering hulks, like you see in Star Wars or something. They may be very nimble things like pieces of software, right, for call centers and so forth, that can substitute this task production. So there's automation lurking here. So I want you to think of two kinds of capital. The capital that goes in here, and I want to call that robot capital, and the capital that goes in there, which I want to call machine capital. Okay, so that's the idea, that robots or capital is schizophrenic. It can smile upon you and work with you, or it might bite your head off, right? Depending on where it's going into the production process. So as I said, capital comes in two flavors, K, which I'll call machines, complementary to labor, R, which I'll call robots, which might be substitutes for labor. Okay, so now I want to marry this idea with this idea of the human physical asymmetry. Okay, so let me do that very quickly. So to do that, what's interesting is we have to look at the robot sector in particular. Okay, I want to look at the robot sector. And the robot sector has a production function just like any other. It's just one of the same production functions that I put up here. Instead of I for the sector, I'm putting R to just tell you that it's the robot sector. It also has its chota mota production function where the tasks are produced using maybe robots and human input, right? Production of robots by means of robots is by no means an impossibility. Yeah. So now I want you to think of what the robot price is going to look like. Well, look at its inputs. The robots have two inputs. They have machine capital and they have tasks, right? So the robot price is going to be a mix, a convex combination, if you like, right, of the machine capital price and the tasks price. Okay, so the superscript here, they both look like R. I'm really sorry, but this is a tau. That's the price of tasks. Yeah. Okay, what else do we know? Well, we know that tasks are also an output and they are produced using robots, maybe, and humans. So the price of tasks will be also a convex combination, this time of the price of robots and the price of human beings. Okay, so there are two numbers here. C, which is the dependence of robot production on machine capital, and A, which is the degree of automation of tasks in robot production. And now what we'll do is put these two things together and we'll get an equation which is only slightly more complicated, but which has real meaning, okay? And the real meaning, I'll tell you intuitively, on the left-hand side of this equation, you have the price of robots relative to the price of human beings. And it says that this price of robots relative to the price of human beings is given by this particular formula, okay? And it says that, for example, if human beings are going to become expensive relative to capital, which is going to happen when you have economic growth, then the price of robots, so this object is going to go down, then the price of robots is going to have to fall relative to the price of human beings. That's the important point I want you to understand. Why? Because to make robots, you need two things. Just like you're making a robot cake. You need sugar, you need eggs. The price of eggs is going up, the price of sugar is constant, right? So the price of robots, so the price of the cake has to be somewhere between the price of sugar and the price of eggs. That's what this statement is saying, right? So I've written that equation down again, and I want to just show you in terms of a diagram what happens. Okay, so very quickly, as humans become more expensive relative to capital, the price of robots tends to become cheaper relative to humans. Okay. And it asymptotes to this limit, where this limit is given by the degree of automation, and it's given by the degree of dependence on production on the use of machine capital. Okay, so now I want you to entertain one line of theory with me, and the line is this. I want to argue that there's going to be automation in all sectors, not just the robot sector. I'm going to make that argument. So I'm going to make that argument using a proof, which is called a proof by contradiction. And this is the way I'm going to work. I'm going to say, suppose there isn't automation. Then I know that because of the human physical asymmetry, as the economy grows, humans are going to become expensive relative to physical capital. Then I know from this robot equation that robots are going to become cheap relative to humans. Nothing to do with technical progress. I'm making a very elementary argument. But as robots become cheap, notice that not only is this line coming down, but this intercept term will also tend to come down. The amount of automation will tend to go up. The amount of dependence on machine capital will tend to go up. So the diagram is really like this. It's worse than the left side. It's more like the right side because that limit point is also coming down. And when that happens, robots become even cheaper relative to humans. But then, of course, there's going to be widespread automation of tasks, because in that tasks production function, not just in the robot sector, but in every sector, robots are going to be increasingly cheaper relative to humans. Now, notice this is a very weird argument, because I started by saying, let's suppose this is false, and then we've got a contradiction. Okay, so we've got a contradiction because this only can be false, and therefore we use the fact that human wages are going to go up, right? So you might ask, okay, you got yourself a contradiction, but what actually does happen in this model? And the answer is, what happens here is therefore you cannot avoid automation. Automation will have to go up over time in every sector. And the interesting thing is that even if automation is happening, it cannot happen very fast. Because if it happens very fast, then you'll knock out labor very fast. If you knock out labor very fast, human wages are going to fall. But if human wages fall, individual industries won't have the incentive to automate. Okay? So the automation has to be what I call automation creep, right? It has to creep into our lives. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. That's why this is called the future of development. It's trying to look several decades into the future, hopefully several decades, maybe some centuries, right? And the idea is that there's going to be automation creep. And what that gives you the very interesting corollary, I think, that you're going to get a vanishing share of labor, despite the fact that the absolute human wage is going to climb. Okay, so that's the little prediction of this crystal ball. And if you're looking at it with a skeptical expression on your face, I can't see all your faces, but if you are, I don't blame you. You should look at things with a skeptical expression on your face, okay? But this is the prediction made by a model of this kind. So let's entertain it for a little while. Okay? So as I said, what happens to absolute human wages? And I already told you this. I made a note on this proof by contradiction. And I made this point already that relative impoverishment could coexist with absolute enrichment. Okay. Now, this is what I call the fourth fundamental law of capitalism. Yeah. And as you might imagine, there are many escape routes from it. We have to defend the law. I don't have to defend the law, but we have to examine the law. So, for example, you could say, okay, but this relied on the assumption that there's consistent economic growth. There's persistent economic growth. Otherwise, human beings would not have become cheaper, expensive relative to capital. And my answer is, sure, we can change the fourth fundamental law to a weaker law. Either in the long run, an economy will stagnate or it will automate. Okay, you can state the law in that form if you like. Yeah? So that's what happens if there's no growth. The next thing which has surely come into your head is, come on, Debraj, give me a break, right? It's not that all sectors can be automated. What about your beloved Ravindra Sangeet, right? What about, all sorts of arts and poetry and humanities? And to me, the answer is, yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't entirely agree, given that, even unfortunately, live concerts and music and even poetry can be automated. I don't entirely agree. But I agree that there's room here for philosophy. There's room here for the arts, for poetry. The question is, if there is room in the market for these things. Okay, is there room in the market? Will the market pay big bucks for people reciting poems, for people doing philosophy, for people doing art? I hope so, okay? And if that's the case, then we'll all become artists and poets, and the fourth fundamental law will not be a problem, okay? But I wouldn't bet on it, yeah, given especially how people seem to react in the market to things like philosophy and poetry. Okay. The third thing is a slightly different statement. It looks like the second statement, but it's not the second statement. The third is, okay, Debraj, fine, no sector is protected, but what if all the time new sectors emerge which are human friendly? Okay, so the story I want you to think of is that each sector is getting automated, each sector is getting crept out, right? But then a new sector comes, and that new sector gives you room, and human beings kind of rush into that sector, and then that sector slowly gets automated. Then they rush to another sector, and the answer is that would well happen, but it depends on the composition of demand. Is there any particular reason to believe that written inside our genetic code is some feature that will always make us crave for new human-friendly sectors? I hope so, okay, but I wouldn't bet on it. It may be that we crave for iPods and iPads, right, which can be made in a highly automated way. It's unclear what the new commodities are that we're going to crave for. But there is room here. That's why I said it depends on the composition of demand. And finally, what is our fourth escape route? Maybe technical progress will come to our rescue. Maybe technical progress will always create a new space for humans to work with. Again, I wouldn't bet on any of this, Because after all, if you think about technical progress, we want to think about technical progress, which is directed. What does directed mean? Directed means that, there are firms which engage in technical progress. And those firms will engage in technical progress by trying to replace the more expensive input. That's the progress that will sell in the market. So if human beings are getting more expensive over time, I wouldn't bet on the fact that technical progress will do the opposite of replacing humans. Okay, it might help you along. So, but I've nevertheless put up this slide because I want to think about possible escape routes from this fourth law. You might think, for example, that, economics professors maybe will always survive. How can we ever automate somebody like Debraj, right? And the answer is don't bet on it. You bet that he's perfectly automatable, right? There's online courses being taught by great people. Nothing is potentially free of automation. Okay, so that's my look into the crystal ball. And as I wanted to say is that this argument works in the absence of technical progress. So this is a wonderful article from the Boston Globe written in 2016. Okay, so close to 6 years ago. And it says, nothing humans do as a job is uniquely safe anymore. From hamburgers to healthcare, machines can be created to successfully perform such tasks. Okay? Now, I won't read out the rest of the quote. You can read them, but I want you to look at one word in the quote, which is hamburgers. Okay, and why do I want you to look at that quote? Well, one word. So, well, hamburgers, if you go or whatever, mutton burgers or veggie burgers, if you go to Evergreen, it's not like the machines producing these things, right? And they're not doing that in McDonald's either. And the reason they're not doing it is because labor is so cheap for producing hamburgers. So the technology exists, trust me, for flipping hamburgers at a tremendous rate using machines. But the technology may not have been implemented because labor is so cheap. So is that the only way we are going to escape automation, by keeping labor incredibly cheap? And the answer is, from the human physical asymmetry, that in the long run, we are unfortunately not going to be able to do that. That is, our very absolute enrichment is going to mean our relative impoverishment relative to capital. Okay, so that's the point. And the other thing I wanted to say about why technical progress is not such a big deal is this. Now I'm going to run out of time, but I'm going to tell you very quickly about this because this is one of my favorite examples. This is a computer called AlphaZero, which actually beat the world Go master, right? Go is an incredibly difficult game compared to chess, right? Chess, at least we can conceive of. Go has more moves than the whatever number of atoms in the universe. I mean, it's just extraordinary, right? Go has so many possibilities. So writing a program to beat the Go master, the world's leading Go master, is a very different proposition from beating Kasparov, right? And in fact, the computer that beat Kasparov, I forget what was it, Deep Blue or something. The computer that beat Kasparov was programmed in a way that we can understand as human beings. Namely, it's almost like doing dynamic programming, right? You assign values to different positions on the board. There's an algorithm that we can at least understand. And then it beat Kasparov. The program for beating the Go master was never written. It was only a little piece of software that taught this machine how to play Go. And then it locked the machine in a room. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating. Okay, it put the machine in a quiet place. And then the machine just started playing billions of games against itself. And each time it lost, it would throw out, using a Darwinian evolutionary process, it would just throw out the algorithm that made it lose, right? And keep that one that made it win. By the end of a few hours or a few days, I don't know how long they trained the machine is unrecognizable by human beings what strategy it's using, okay? And to prove this, what they did was they removed the Go instructions and just plugged in the instructions for playing chess, and then locked the machine up again for 4 hours, okay, while it played chess against itself. And then the machine emerges and beats the world's #1 chess playing machine, which is Stockfish. So what I'm trying to tell you is that machine learning has created a dramatic difference in the way software can adapt to different circumstances. So it's a very different deal now from writing an individual program for each kind of object. So now, so let me move on here, and let me just say one thing about this slide. In the bottom line is that, as I've said before, the fourth law is a statement about the relative distribution of income, and not the absolute amount of income. So it's entirely possible that absolute incomes rise while relative incomes fall. The second thing that I want to say is that it's a statement about the functional distribution of income and not the personal distribution of income. It says, Bhaiya, if all you have is your human labor as your endowment, then the share of your income is going to go to zero. It doesn't say, Bhaiya, if you can accumulate capital endowment, that the share of your income is going to go to zero. It doesn't say that. Okay, so it is very important to understand that there's a difference between the notion of functional and personal. So which leads us, as John Maynard Keynes said, that there will be no harm in making mild preparations for our destiny. So let's think about how we make preparations for this destiny in which a fourth law might be operated. Okay. And I want to divide up those preparations into two parts very quickly: individual and social. The individual part I'm going to leave out for this talk because I'm going to run out of time, but I want to talk about, but in this part, I talk about the importance of every human being, okay? In a poverty-struck society, this is extremely difficult, but at least in middle-income societies, at least in relatively richer societies, of trying to understand that we have to build endowments other than human endowments. Financial education should be taught in school. It's more important than sex education. Right? We have to teach both financial education and sex education in the sense of how to be responsible about this. Now, I am going to leave this part out in the interest of time. But of course, as you guys might imagine, especially in poor countries, we have to be pessimistic about the possibility of intelligent and informed equity holding. Okay, we can't just ride roughshod over the presence of poverty. But even without poverty, it's very hard. But society, the last line of this slide is very important. Society has to learn how to equitably scale up alienable endowments for everybody. Okay. So for this last part of my talk, guys, you're welcome to, let's see, I can see Satvik here. Satvik, can I go on for another 10 minutes or will I be killing everything here?
So you can go.
Yes, sir, you can.
Can I go, Rhea? Is that okay? Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Everybody hasn't fallen asleep, right? I can't see everybody, but in case they have, well, 10 more minutes. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about how to socially scale alienable endowments. Okay. So now this is a part also which all of you have seen. Okay, this is the part about universal basic income, the possibility of setting a share of our national income aside to make unrestricted payments to humans. But what I want to do is, because I have so few minutes, I want to talk about how to build a base for universal basic income. So I'm going to jump to that. So here's the social alternatives that I want to talk about, which is sovereign funds. Okay, so this is the last, for the last 5 to 7 minutes of my talk. So as I said, I think that really we all have responsibilities to think about what will happen if jobless growth continues, and that we all have to build up endowments of non-human endowments. But I think that society as a whole, the government as a whole, in every country, including developing countries, has a very important obligation to try and build sovereign funds. Okay. Now, this is all the more important because we don't want to think about universal basic income as things which are taken out of things like NREGA, right? Social insurance of different kinds. Universal basic income is a transfer. It cannot substitute for basic rights like the right to, if I want to work, if I want to have the right to employment as an NREGA, I should have the right to employment. If I want, I have a right to healthcare. I have a right to basic nutrition. So I don't think about these as substituting for universal basic income. This is a build-up that we have to do over the coming decades and maybe over the coming centuries, right? As a dividend, which is an extra dividend, which all of us has a right to as a human being, right? Which is a dividend paid from national wealth. So as I've written, from stocks and not from flows. So this is very, very often confused sometimes, because people often like to say, oh, so you just want to give some rupias to people and then take away NREGA, and you want to take away their, right to nutrition and right to basic food and health. Not at all. That's at least not the way I like to think about it, okay? This, I think, of a much more fundamental right. This is the right to a share in a country's prosperity. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the fact that the most capitalist country in the world has one of these, okay? So there's the famous Alaska Permanent Fund, okay, which takes 25% of the state income from natural resources and pays a citizen dividend out every year. Man, if the United States can do something like this, other countries certainly can, right? And in fact, here's the quote from Jay Hammond. It says, Alaska's natural resources are owned by the Alaskan people themselves. Now take a somewhat less capitalist country, well, maybe not less capitalist, but at least on the face of it, more social democrat, right? Norway. It has a huge fund, which is based on oil. It's called the Norway Fund, or whatever the translation of that is. It's oil-based. It has around $200,000 per Norwegian citizen as we speak. It could pay out a dividend. Right now, it doesn't pay it, okay? It uses it for some social activities, for part of the budget, but as of now, it doesn't pay a dividend. My question is, why should we only think of funds that are based on natural resources? What's so natural about natural resources? Why can't we have funds that are based on all sorts of economic resources? Yeah. So that's my philosophical and pragmatic question to you guys. Why can't we have sovereign funds that go beyond natural resources? And as I said, this has a both philosophical and a pragmatic angle. The philosophy is very clear from the first part of my talk, that if something like the fourth fundamental law really holds, we all need to jointly use shares of physical capital. And natural resources only form a variable part of that base. And the pragmatics comes from the logistics of fund building, okay, that I want to talk about now. So now, this is work that Parikshit Ghosh, who I hope that you'll all meet. I assume that the majority of you are college students, but if you go to the Delhi school someday, you will run across Parikshit. The pragmatics comes from the logistics of fund building, and in fact, Parikshit and I, in our paper, we note that there are several proposals, for example, in the United States, based on charity, kuch paisa de do to the sovereign fund, right? There is financial transactions tax. If paisa de do doesn't work, tax financial transactions, tax capital income, transfer existing government assets. You can think of all sorts of things, spectrum auctions. You can run the gamut of all sorts of tax procedures, right? But we don't want to do it this way. We want to do it slightly differently. Okay. The way we want to do it is we want to build a sovereign fund, which is a portfolio of equity, bonds, and other financial assets. It would be managed professionally, just as any fund would be managed. And the most important point is that a fraction of this return will be paid out as a citizen's dividend. The payout is going to be slow. It's not like in the first year of building an India sovereign fund, we can pay out anything. I'm looking ahead at what we can pay out in 100 years, in 150 years, right, from this fund. Now, how do I propose to build this fund? And this is where I think our proposal is novel, and I think it's important. It has two parts. The first part is a one-time directive on existing publicly traded companies. I hope nobody from Reliance is watching this, otherwise I'll be decapitated very soon, okay? Which is that you issue X%, where X is a number that we can decide on jointly as citizens, right? Of existing share base to the government. Dilute your shares, issue X% to the government. Immediate dilution of shareholder value is going to occur, right? And those funds are going to be held by the government. The second part is an ongoing directive that whenever you issue a new share, if you issue it when you're paying one of your executives, if you issue it just because you want to issue new shares, if you're issuing it whether you have an IPO or you're expanding an existing share base, you pay X% in that share in the form of shares to the government. Okay, this X and that X may be different X's. Okay, I'm not wedded to having the same X for both. Okay, but you have to issue this to the government. Now, the enormous advantage of payment via dilution is that stock issues by listed firms on the Bombay Stock Exchange or whatever stock exchange are easy to track, right? You don't have to audit Ambani's portfolio, Adani's portfolio, my portfolio, Amitabh Bachchan's portfolio. You don't have to keep track of anybody. Yeah, you just, because their shareholder value is going to get diluted when you issue this dilution over here. Does everybody understand this point? Yeah, this is an important point. So every investor automatically pays this tax without having to look for people and audit people and so forth. Right? And no payment is required in cash. This is the standard complaint of billionaires in the United States. Hey man, you can't ask me to, you can't tax my unrealized capital gains. I mean, I don't have the cash to pay for it. So this is Porikit's famous line, which he wrote in an email to me. He says, Elon, just hand over the stock and save the brokerage fee, right? So that's all you have to do. You pay in stock. Nobody's asking you to pay in cash. Yeah. So just let's just expand expand the share base. All in all, I submit to you that this is an extremely effective form of taxation. Now, I want to be very clear about this, that this is not socialism, right? This is not a plan for the government to take over the means of production. The state is not going to organize and manage production. Okay, but you'd say, oh, but what if the state, gets enough shareholding so that it can now have a say in the corporation's decisions? And the answer is, man, I don't want the state to have any say in the corporation, in the corporate's decision. So issue Class B shares to the state, which give them no voting rights whatsoever. This is not for the government for getting into the business of private sector production. It's for the government for getting into the business of owning private sector production, which is very different. Right? The other important advantage is the political incentives of this, that citizens are going to come into closer political alignment. Because what we're doing is, if everybody gets a fraction of the incorporated wealth of a country, then we get a fraction of capital income, then we get a fraction of labor income. This is not to say that, oh, everything will become utopian and everything will be hunky-dory. There'll still be inequality in the world, right? But that inequality will not be cast in functional terms. Give this person a subsidy, give that sector a subsidy, tax capital less, tax capital more. That is going to come down. Okay. So there are other advantages that I could talk about. There are disadvantages that I could talk about. And if you guys are interested, I'll send you the slides. But I think this is a good place to stop. So there are also variations which you can do on this to mimic unrealized capital gains taxes. But there's a good place to stop. Let me summarize for you. Okay, so I've talked about the fourth fundamental law, okay, which is that the labor share must decline even as absolute wages rise. Do I believe it? I don't know. Some days of the week I believe it. Some days of the week I don't, right? I mean, this is just like looking into the crystal ball. It's at least a way to, it's an interesting thing to think about. Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about the future. So we discuss various aspects of this. And then the main lesson is that human endowments, to translate this into personal distribution, human endowments need to fundamentally change. Okay? And I really didn't talk about it, but I said that there are two parts, the individual responses and the social responses. And I talked more about the social responses. That has two parts, universal basic income and how to build a fund. I didn't talk about universal basic income, but what I tried to do was tell you a little bit about building a social fund on the basis of share dilution. Okay, so I'll stop there. Let me turn off my screen and I'll take questions if you guys have any.
Thank you, sir, for this amazing session. Audience can send the questions to question moderator. Or Farid, you can go ahead. Yeah.
So, sir, I asked this coming from a music background. Basically, I play the piano and guitar. But
Okay.
what you started talking about with the automation and how robots start coming in, I have seen that happening here as well. Now someone can just program my notes. I'm not needed anymore. So I'm probably asking this because I'm scared for the future, but when you're assuming a downward slope, are we assuming that there'll be no change in jobs? Because I would like to think that if you're building robots to replace humans, there is still humans at the top of the chain who's producing those robots and who's
That's an excellent question. Okay. By the way, that speaks to that part of the slide where I talked about the tasks in robot production being produced by humans or robots. So now the question is, will there at least always be humans involved in the highest endeavor, namely in the task of automation? Can the task of automation itself be automated? Right? Now you're asking philosophical questions. You're not the first person to ask them. One of the first persons to ask them was John von Neumann. Right? So von Neumann talked about this idea of a singularity, and the singularity, that's why I talked about production of robots by means of robots, right? So if you have singularity, even in the production of machines, if you have machines that can, actually, I wish I had the quote, I could have read that out for you. So even that is not safe, right? I'm not assuming, as you say, this downward sloping curve. I'm trying to point at the possibility that this curve can be derived, right, from more primitive assumptions. Now, do I believe it? As I said, I'm not sure. But as you pointed out with music, this is why I hesitated, right? We know that a lot of music composition can be done in an automated way, right? So these are great questions, and I appreciate them. So who's next?
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have a question. Sir,
Yes.
I have a question. Sir, you are saying that, automation will, from what I understand, my takeaway is that automation will kind of homogenize skill sets, right? That people are developing, because we will be only required at the upper end of the value chain, right? So isn't that going to be an anathema for growth itself? If skill sets are homogenized and everybody is developing the same skill set, then how will growth even continue? So isn't that going to be kind of counter-cyclical to growth?
Thank you. Samira, is that you? Did I get your name right? Yeah. Thanks, Samira. Yeah, so actually that's I was very quick in describing that little model, but that's not how the model works. What happens is that over time, you get more and more different sectors, and automation is not necessarily complete in any one of those sectors. Okay, so there are humans in a variety of sectors. Remember that it's impossible for humans to be out of a job, because if humans are out of a job, then they'll become so cheap that they'll undercut robot production in the absence of technical progress. So humans are always employed. And when you say that they move on to higher end sectors, it doesn't mean that there are only one or two sectors sitting at the higher end. There's sectors there. The mental picture I want you to have is not a staircase of sectors which ends, but a staircase of sectors which is infinite, right? Like Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, right? It's going all the way on to one side. And then those sectors are all sparsely populated by humans, but one by one, they're getting automated. That doesn't mean that there is any ending to that story, right? Now, the second thing I want you to note, Samira, is that all of this income is going to accrue not perhaps to workers if workers don't hold capital endowments, but they will accrue to human beings somewhere. Somebody's holding those endowments, right? Somebody's holding claims to those robots. Those robots are not holding claims to themselves. So all of this national income that is getting produced, even if it gets produced by capital, is going to accrue to human beings. That was not the point of what I was saying. All I was saying is that it's going to accrue very unequally to them. So the scope for growth is always there, unfortunately, in this model. I'm saying unfortunately because it is the process of growth itself that is driving automation. Does that help, Samira?
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, sir. Thank you.
Okay, sure. You're welcome. Who's next?
So there was a question in the chat box from Nitya Kapoor. Nitya, you can unmute and ask a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Excellent talk, sir.
Thank you.
I just had a question with the great resignation being witnessed right now with labor, with a lot of people switching jobs and a lot of people resigning due to work from home conditions. Do you think the fourth law is accelerating, like we're seeing it happening faster?
Nitya, that's a great question. Okay, that's a really good question. And I've been thinking about this also. So think about this whole horrible pandemic that we've been through, or we are going through, right? And not just the great resignation, but more than that, look at it also from the side of the firms. They're seeing suddenly that human labor is a very delicate object, right? They can become sick. They can become sick, not only IID sick, they can become correlated sick, right? Which is what happens in a pandemic. Enormous labor costs. These people all have to be dealt with. They have to be allowed to go, online, and at least in societies where online is possible. Leave aside our poor, our migrants and laborers who can't even do that, right? In such sectors, if you look at it from the corporate point of view, forget a bit about the great resignation. From the corporate point of view, human labor becomes doubly suspect, right? The next time around, people want to rely less on human labor. So I think what you're saying is whether this will accelerate the fourth law. I think my hesitant but possible answer to that is yes, because it just makes labor look more costly from a firm's point of view. Next question. I see Purikit is here. Purikit, why don't you unmute yourself so that everybody can see you? Oh, you have a question, in fact. There he is.
Hey, so I'm the infamous Purikit he has been talking about, just across the street from you guys. So Debraj, my question is about, great talk, by the way. My question is about endogenous labor supply, right? So I presume in your analysis, there's a fixed number of human beings, right? So, and a fixed amount of labor supply, which is not the same thing. So what we have seen over history is that, the work hours, for example, has changed a lot over the long, Europe, many places have 4-day work weeks, whereas if you go back to Dickens's England, people were working all the time. So can we imagine, either driven by preferences or policy, that as these forces play out, that people shrink their labor supply, and in the limit, everybody goes in on Monday for an hour and presses a few buttons and comes home. So,
right.
So this expanding number of robots and shrinking hours, couldn't the latter force sort of counteract and change the results?
Okay, so the answer to that is no, and let me explain why. Firstly, I am not assuming a fixed amount of labor, though. Just making this point clear. We were doing all of this in per capita space. So it may be that there's ongoing population growth and so forth, but we were talking about per capita space. But that's not Purikit's question. Purikit is asking, what if we actually move to, a 4-day work week, we shrink our work week? Notice that will have the effect of raising human wages even more quickly. Okay, as you shrink the labor supply relative to capital, that is going to expand, that's going to raise wages more quickly and accelerate the process of automation. Now, Purikit could reply to that, yes, but if we can manage to hold a share of non-human inputs, like robots or capital and so forth, we'll be okay. We can move to, as he said, a 1-day work week. There'll be no problem. So he's exactly right. If we can all equitably hold shares of non-human capital. But if we can't hold equitably shares of non-human capital, then the shrinkage of labor is going to, of course, improve the absolute growth rate of wages, but it cannot alter the relative share of labor going to zero. So that's what we can discuss more on this, but that's the broad point I wanted to make. So it's great to see you here, Purikit. I even quoted from you. I don't know whether you saw that.
Yeah, I saw that. I never imagined.
Yeah, well, there's always a first time, buddy. Yeah. Moushumi.
Yeah, Debraj, I thought Porkit is a co-author.
Sorry, what? You saw what? You thought?
I thought Porkit was your co-author, so I was a bit surprised that he's asking question, but never mind.
Only on half of it, not on the other half.
Anyway, so my question is, why do you guys insist on a share? Why it can't be a standard redistribution, current redistribution from profit to, so why is it that it has to be in the form of profit income, which is in the form of share and not a direct redistribution? Why do you differentiate between this, current and future? Yeah. What is the importance of that?
Got it. Okay, that's a very good question. So let me just say a little bit about. So let's move away from this issue of universal basic income, but just think of the broader question of cash transfers versus in-kind transfers in India, right? Now, if you talk to people who are really, real observers of the Indian economy, right? Like Jean Drèze or Ritika Khera. There are many others, right? Let's call them, just for the lack of a better word, a little bit to the left on the Indian scene, right? What is the main problem that the left has with cash transfers? The main problem that the left has with cash transfers is that it looks brittle. It rests on nothing, right? It can, if inflation accelerates, the cash transfer can disappear. If there's no appropriate indexation, it can disappear. Whereas if everybody is getting, let's say, X kilos of food through the public distribution system, the X kilos cannot disappear just because there's inflation happening. Okay, so there's a very natural fear that people have about cash as opposed to land or food or in-kind and so forth, right? And I think it's a real fear. So imagine that any government says, okay, from now on, we shall give 5,000 rupees a month of cash to people. What is that 5,000 rupees going to be worth in 5 years from now? Are we going to then go back to Parliament and say, "Arey Naya, we need a new law, we need to amend the law, now it should be 10,000, then 5 years later it should be 15,000. Every time we'll have to fight for it." So Porikit and my instincts very naturally turn to the idea of a share. Let's not go 5,000. Let's commit to give all citizens of India 1% of GDP. I don't care what that percentage point is, 1%, X%, whatever it is. But the word percent is very important. Okay. And the word percent, if we can write a law on the basis of the word percent, X% of the shares, whatever, percent. If we can do that, then we are protected automatically from things like inflation. Right? You don't have to worry about inflation. Let the prices double, triple, with a percent of that, it's still going to double, triple. Okay. And I think this is a very important issue. Moushumi, I have more to say about this, but I hope that's a partial answer.
Sure.
Okay. I can stop anytime, by the way, Satvik or Ria, if you want to stop me, but I'm also happy to keep going. I'm woken up now.
So I think we can take a few more questions then.
Okay. And maybe I can see some people's faces when they ask questions. So, anybody else?
When you suggest such a policy, radical or not, such a far-sighted policy, how do you actually see governments picking it up, let alone the Indian government? What?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't say let alone the Indian government. I'm not necessarily talking about the current Indian government or the past Indian government, but India has been a leader in innovative policies. Okay, so I wouldn't say that let alone, but your question is a good one, and I think that's why building up a sovereign fund is not something that has to be done overnight. It can be done slowly. Okay, we don't have to get an inferiority complex relative to Norway. For example, Norway can say we are devoting 5% to the sovereign fund. India can devote 5% to the sovereign fund. It doesn't mean that India is, devoting the same number of dollars. India is devoting a lower number of dollars. So what, right? Again, percent is the appropriate thing because we can then compare commitments across countries of widely different economic backgrounds. Yeah. The process I'm talking about is not going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years, even though we are starting to see the tail of the storm a little bit, right, in terms of jobless growth and so forth. It's a process that, if it happens at all, is going to happen over decades. By that time, you guys will be old, let alone people like me, right? And so it's a long preparation for the future. And it's a change of our mindset that we need more than anything else. What else?
First of all, sir, I want to thank Dr. Mausami Das and Dr. Parikshit Ghosh for joining the meet. And also, if any of the college professors and faculty attending this meet want to ask a question, please do so.
By the way, this topic I talked about today is going to be the last chapter of the second edition of my development book, which I'm going to be writing after 25 years. Maybe some of you have seen my book. And but it's not written yet. The last chapter is almost written, but the intermediate chapters are still missing to some extent. But anyway, I hope this will be the closing chapter. Yeah. Well, are we all done?
Yes, sir, I think so. Hasil, you can take over.
I think we are done with the Q&A. Thank you, sir. And I'll just ask Sanjeev, sir, to take up the mic and just say a few words.
Thanks a lot, Professor Debraj Ray. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this talk in college, and on behalf of St. Stephen's College, especially the economics department, the economic society, and all the participants, all the students in economics department and the faculty. Let me thank you. This is just a fascinating talk, a very difficult question, something you looked at it in a way which is very different from the way most of us think about the issue. You tackled very difficult questions in a fairly rigorous way, careful thought. But what is surprising is that it was combined, such careful analysis was combined with, a way of presenting it. So it was great fun, and your sense of excitement carried forward to all of us. And I'm like most of my colleagues here, we actually are very familiar with your textbook. It's actually a prescribed textbook in Delhi University. Third-year students use it for 2 semesters. And for many years, we have been waiting for the new edition. I hope it comes out. And if this is the last chapter, it increases our excitement about the new edition. And it's great to see you and to hear you. Thank you very much on behalf of our college and department. Thank you, sir. And I also like to thank Parikshit and Mausami for being present here. And I also thank all the participants and my colleagues who joined at this late hour, early for you, but approaching dinner time now in India, and being present and participating in the discussion. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sanjeev, sir. And I'll just hand it over to Rajneesh for the vote of thanks.
So good evening to everyone present here. On behalf of the Economic Society, St. Stephen's College, I deem it a great honor and privilege to extend my heartiest thanks to our Reverend Speaker, Dr. Debraj Ray, who bestowed us with insightful information about the future of development. I am sure every one of us is enlightened by your knowledge and presence, sir. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to our principal, Professor John Varghese, and Bursar, Mr. Goethe, who gave us the opportunity to organize this sagacious lecture as a part of the National Economic Festival. I would also like to deeply thank our staff advisor, Ms. Poonam Kalra, for her constant support and motivation in all our endeavors. A big thanks to Sanjeev sir and all our faculty members who took the time out of their day to attend our event. We would also like to thank Prof. Ray Maddow for sponsoring our event. Unfeigned thanks to all our audience for their active participation. Thank you to everyone for joining, and we hope you had a wonderful experience. Good evening.
Thank you so much, sir.
Bye. Bye, everyone.